Yo creo.
Good afternoon. I think we can get started. My name is Francisco Fonseca. I'm the co-secretary with Mr. Torreblanca of this course, and I'm moderating this panel, which is a great honor for me, given the quality of the panelists that we will have with us this afternoon. We have all kind of moderators, but I'm going to be a moderator. But I would like to explain we have a course that is called QUO VADIS, the new geopolitic situation. And with the agreement of the High Representative, we've drafted this program. And we thought that having a specific session on climate change and the energy challenge is no doubt one of the key elements of a geopolitical Europe. That's why I believe today's discussion is fundamental for the course and that we will all be learning from it. As I'm going to just be a moderator, I finish my brief words here. Today in the panel we have two Cristinas. Cristina Narbona, first Vice President of the Spanish Senate, Minister of the Environment between 2004 and 2008, and Cristina Lobillo, director of the well-known energy platform in Europe, and that no doubt will be telling us about everything we wanted to know and ask about energy. We will first give the floor to Cristina Lobillo, who will give us a European framework of what the situation is. Cristina is from Córdoba. She has a degree in law from the University of Córdoba. After working in the Spanish administration, including the cabinet of the culture minister Cañete between 2004 and 2008, started to be a civil servant in the European Commission. She's haven't been there yet for 20 years, but almost. Yes, in the European Commission. She's been a civil servant in areas as important as agriculture, trade, and energy. And I would also like to highlight that for 5 years she's been heading the cabinet of the former High Representative, alias Cañete, and she's now Director for Energy Policy. First of all, a coordinator of energy policies, and now of the energy platform in Europe that wants to be a task force that tries to solve the puzzle that the situation has become. So without further ado, I give you the floor and you have a PowerPoint to share with us. Good afternoon and thank you all. First of all, I would like to thank the High Representative of the EU for the invitation. I believe this is the 20th year you organized this course, and therefore it's a well-known course, and it's an honor to be here with you and to share the panel with Cristina Narbona, who I deeply admire. I agree that climate and energy policies have a fundamental role in the definition of geopolitics in the EU. I'm going to try to, in 20 minutes, sum up. Let's see if I can do so because it's a very complex policy. I'm going to try and explain the context where we come from and what is the situation in the EU nowadays, specifically for energy policy after the non-provoked invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I've prepared a presentation so that you can see more clearly what the situation is. To understand the present, we need to understand where we come from. And here there is a slide that explains the Paris Agreement and the European Green Deal, which is the framework for the environment in Europe. I believe everyone knows this, but the EU is the bloc of countries in the world that has always had a climate policy that has been the most ambitious in the world beyond the US and other many countries that might also be ambitious. We've always been believed in international forums, not only because we had the highest objectives regarding the reduction of gas emissions, but also because we've had the enforced legislation, or we were drafting it, which makes us more credible. The Paris Agreement, as you all know, is a change in climate policy. It's the first time that the United Nations and more than 184 countries agree in the need of putting in place measures to reduce the planet's temperature. And all the countries that signed and ratified the Paris Agreement have started to work on it. The EU has its own objectives to comply with the Paris Agreement, with our own act, the Climate Act, that manifests the obligation of reducing our emissions in a 52% by 2030, which is an ambitious objective. And this is in a strategy that is called the European Green Deal, that inspires all our policies, including the budgetary policy, where we have to use a 30% in areas that have to do with climate change in all policies in the EU. So that was the situation and where we are at now. But meanwhile, you all know what has happened. First of all, there is a complex situation for the energy sector. In October last year, there was an increase of the price of gas in the world that was very significant, provoked by the financial recovery after COVID. Asian countries like China started to purchase gas in a massive manner like it had never happened before, which created high tension in international markets that affected the whole world, but more specifically the EU. You know that the EU doesn't have gas stored. We import around 90% of the gas that we use for heating, but not for electricity production. Therefore, that change in prices in the global market had a greater effect on the EU. With this situation, the European Commission put in place measures to compensate consumers and more vulnerable industries. When this happened, when this was put in place, then the invasion of Ukraine took place, which also manifests our high dependency of the gas, oil, and coal coming from Russia. Before the invasion of Ukraine, I want to say before, unfortunately, because these figures now are smaller, but usually we would import 40% of the gas in Europe came from Russia, 28% of the oil also came from Russia, and 48% of the coal also was coming from Russia. So these figures, each time I mention them, I can see that the EU wasn't aware enough of the need to decrease this dependency, not only because it's Russia, but also because from the viewpoint of competition, it's not good to have such a powerful supplier for the EU. So after what happened in Ukraine, we were able to see that we needed to have a plan in the EU to be independent from the imports of gas, oil, and coal, and it's called Repower EU, and it has mainly three objectives, and I like to talk about the most important one, that is to accelerate energy transition. If we continue to depend on the purchase of gas from third countries or oil or coal, that unfortunately continue to be necessary in the EU, we need to accelerate that energy transition. We need to increase the production of renewables, the capacity of the power installed in the EU, and that's the main aim of the Commission. And that is what is being discussed in the Council. Energy efficiency. We need to consume energy in a more reasonable manner so that we're able to save more energy. And these are the two main pillars in which we base the energy transition. And the EU has been working on this since 2007 when we set the objectives. The second objective of the Repower Plan is to diversify gas supply. And it's obvious that this figure of 40% is something we need to change. We want to find substitutes. I always like to say that this 150 million cubic meters that we import from Russia should be substituted by solar energy, wind energy, or biomass. But unfortunately, it's not so. Renewable energies need some more years to be able to install the plants and store. We have a problem in storage in the EU. So unfortunately, on the short term, we need to substitute gas with gas. And I will explain what we are doing. And the third element of repower is saving, energy savings. In a situation in which the EU, in Spain, and I always say we don't have an important or significant dependency or relevant dependency of Russia, but we don't understand the dimension of the problem. But Central European countries and Eastern European countries like Bulgaria or Romania could have a lack of gas supply throughout the year. They faced a tense situation last year already, and it is also true that these countries understand the dimension of this excessive dependency. On the next slide, I explain with figures, but I'm not going to bore you with figures, but I leave the presentation for anyone that wants to take it in further detail later on. But there are some figures that I would like to highlight. I would like to start with energy transition and renewables. We have a very ambitious objective for production and consumption that was 40% for 2030, and we've increased that to 45%. So apparently it's 5 points in production and consumption, which is means high investment from European countries. And then energy savings that goes from a 9 to a 13% with the use of renewables, and which also requires high investments. And what about LNG? Well, we are looking to what we import from Russia, and here too what we are substituting from Russia. It's not a joke, but I can say that Russia is helping us in doing so, because Gazprom, that is the main distributor of gas, has unilaterally decided things that means that the EU has had to substitute this gas, not only because we have the political objective, but also because we had no other option in the immediate term. Gazprom decided to cut the supply to both Poland and Bulgaria, and then they approved a decree saying that all contracts of Gazprom with EU countries had to be paid in rupees, when usually it was dollars or euros. They also cut the supply to Baltic countries, and Gazprom has now said that they need to do maintenance work. Therefore, this is a strategy that is very clear, that puts the EU in a complex situation in the gas supply. So, as I was saying, in the case of renewables and energy efficiency, we also want to increase imports like things like green hydrogen. We want to help the states to produce and import more green hydrogen. It's at a starting stage, but we have a figure which is 10 million tons of production and consumption by the year 2030, and another 10 million that we want to import from countries that are also working on this adventure. It is important, and as Spaniards, we need to know that countries from Latin America have a great potential, for example, Chile, Colombia, and Argentina, and that we've already in contact with them to see like in 5, 6 years it might be feasible to have this imports of green hydrogen to the EU. So we still need to make more investments on this, but this is also a field that we're working on. Another significant pillar that I mentioned before is energy savings, which is fundamental. I always say that we have to put in place measures in the Commission, but also it has to do with a personal change in mindset, because there's no cleaner energy than the one that we don't consume. And we have to consume also in a more efficient manner. Therefore, we need technologies that are being developed, and nowadays there's funding to do so from the EU. And since the 31st of March, we put in place voluntary plans where we, in July, complemented with a regulation that I will be explaining later on that has to do with voluntary measures of a reduction of a 15% in the gas demand. And later on, if there was some clear imbalance between demand and supply of gas for the EU, to make it compulsory that there should be a reduction of the demand in all European countries. On this slide that you can see now, well, this is an important slide because it talks about what has been done in a very short period of time. In 6 months, we've as I said before, the dependency, as I said before, was at 40%. Now it's of a 20%. Not only because even at 20% is too much, we need to get to a figure of almost zero. But this has been achieved by negotiating with countries like, for example, the US, that has an important production of LNG, and we've multiplied by 3 the LNG that we import from the US. And the figure is in 2021 of the total imports was of 30 million cubic meters, while this year in 2022, only in the first 6 months, we had 22 billion already imported, so we will probably the reach of 50 billion. That would be a third of the gas that we import from Russia. Also, regarding prices, and I like to be transparent and to speak sincerely, the cheapest gas that we receive is the one coming from Russia through their own pipeline, because we don't have to pay for the transport, or not to pay as much, but we have to make the effort of bringing this gas from those countries that can be more reliable. We've signed a bilateral agreement with Egypt and Israel to bring more LNG in the following years. We are also negotiating with Korea, with Japan, with South Africa, and with Azerbaijan, which is the only country where we also bring LNG. The EU created a pipeline to diversify the gas coming from Russia, and this pipeline brings around 8 billion cubic meters, and we want to get up to 20 billion, and we're working with them and with the companies purchasing this gas to make sure that this 20 billion can substitute also part of the Russian gas. And in this context, we've created the energy platform in the EU. We work in teams of regions. We work with countries from the south, center and east of Europe, and the southeastern countries are the ones that face problems like Romania and Bulgaria that I mentioned before, also Central European countries. And I would like to give you a figure of Czech Republic and Hungary that have a dependency of almost 100% of oil that is imported from Russia. and then they have all their refineries adapted to refining the oil coming from Russia. So this is a energy transition process. I hope that in some years we don't have to speak about oil or coal, but nowadays we continue to use them, and we're trying to find substitutes to the Russian production and to try and get it from other sources. Finally, because I want to give time to the questions of funding. Energy efficiency, renewables, even the creation of necessary infrastructures for gas and green hydrogen to be able to be present in Europe needs investment, high levels of investment. And investment can not only come from the public administrations because there's not enough money. We cover a part, but we also need to have a private investment. So what we're doing nowadays in the repower context is to try and mobilize funds, cohesion funds, for example, and also LTS funds, which is a system that regulates emission rights in Europe, to be able to get more funds and be able to build the necessary infrastructures to be able to be independent from Russia. Maybe in Spain, we see it more as an interconnection with Spain and Portugal, with France, something that we've been attempting to achieve for many years now. And maybe now with Repower, it's the time to end having an energy island in the Iberian Peninsula, because we need the interconnection, first of all, for electricity. We only have one, and now that is underground, and that would be up and running in 2025. And we need to continue working to have two more electric interconnections, and also an interconnection that could bring gas in the short term, and later on green hydrogen, which will be the future and what will substitute gas. One last slide about how we work. We are the European Commission, but of course we work with the 27 member states. And in this context, we work on the Repower Plan, on the next generation funds, and I'm sure you've heard about them in the press, because Spain has a high percentage of this funds for energy transition and digital policies. And then, of course, there's a financial side to all of this that has to do with the stability agreement and the stability of the Europe and the political influence. Before finishing, I would like to take a couple of minutes to mention, because I've explained the slides, but what about the geopolitical change? It is true that traditionally our relationships in regarding energy issues were with Russia. Now this changed with the annexion of Crimea, but now we have an international offensive with other countries, but not only for gas imports. We are working with countries that have minerals that we will need in the future for new technologies like lithium and many others that will be used for batteries that will store energy for renewables and that will be used for the electric car. And all this is very much linked to the climate change policy. We don't understand energy policy without it working hand in hand with the climate change policy, because we have a 50% of the greenhouse effect gases, and these two policies need to understand each other, and we cannot understand them separately. I will stop here because I'm sure the most important things will be Cristina's words and all of your questions. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Cristina.
Thank you so much, Cristina. If the audience will allow me, there's something I would like you to clarify. We've seen in your slides that we're going to mobilize European funds up to 300 billion euros for energy transition, diversification, and so on and so forth. But you've also said that there's going to be complementary funding. My question is this being studied, or is it being studied that beyond the next generation plan, could this be extended, or is everything included in the money for its next generation? Well, that's a very good question. Well, the one that knows well about this are others, but yes, this money is in the next generation plan. What the European Commission has proposed is a new chapter inside the resilience and recovery plans in each of the states. It's a plan called the Repower, and it's aimed at using more renewables and creating infrastructures that are needed to be energy independent. The 300 billion, it's a high figure, but it will be increasing the next generation of funds in almost double what we have. But this 20 billion come from the regulation that has to do with emissions rights, and then the member states can transfer up to 5% of the cohesion funds that are not used, because there's always a part that is not used, and there are mechanisms in the EU to be able to get this money back. So this money will be available once the negotiation takes place in the European Parliament. So I don't think this will be the last figure, because member states have to say yes to it and give their approval. But even for the necessary structures for the storage of renewables, it would be important to complement this funds with private funds too. Thank you, and sorry, but I had to ask this question. Now I'm going to give the floor to Cristina Narbona. Cristina Narbona. Well known by everyone, but still I will introduce her. She's an economist of the University of La Sapienza in Rome. She's always developed two careers as a lecturer at university, but also she has been working as a public servant with different positions in the government of Andalusia, also positions in the central government in Spain. She's been Secretary of State, a minister. She nowadays is the first Vice President of the Spanish Senate, and in 2017, if I'm not wrong, she was she's the president of the Socialist Party in Spain. But the most important thing I have to say from Cristina is something that she always says and demonstrates her intellectual energy, and that is that she's always declared herself to be an economist that considers that there cannot be an economy without taking into account ecology. So this is something that she's been saying for many years, and which makes even more interesting what she's going to speak about today. So please, Cristina, could you please explain from the Spanish perspective, what is Spain doing, what do we need, and how we can build together with the EU instead of fighting them?
Thank you so much, Paco, and thanks to Cristina for your talk. You're right. I'd like to start out by saying a few words about the relationship that exists between climate emergency and the energy emergency, because these are two situations which are both affecting us. The climate emergency has been affecting us for a while now, but perhaps this summer there have been far more people in Spain who've realized that climate change, as that Vice President said this morning, this isn't just a matter of faith, this is something that's happening. We've had wildfires this summer, wildfires where we've seen huge percentage of fires that are very different in the way they evolve in comparison to the past. More lightning, that's due to temperature. Soil that's reached normal temperatures of 60 degrees, so new climatic phenomena this summer, with a heat wave which has been almost continuous and has met that record levels of tropical climate nights, that is above 25 degrees in many regions of Spain. Hundreds of people have died this year because of the heat wave, and now Spain really does need to be more efficient about the way it manages water, because there's clearly a scarcity of water, and I'll tell you later about how this forms a part of adaptation to climate change that we need to bring about. Energy emergency where we've been living has been very, very well explained by Cristina. It arrives from our dependence on Russia, but also a delay by European countries in their energy transition. Because this energy emergency we wouldn't have if we'd actually done something more quickly with regard to the climate emergency. I remember hearing for the first time, energy transition being spoken about by people from Germany. It was a time when, in comparison to Spain, things were a bit tough because Germany had 10 more solar photovoltaic panels installed than Spain. And this has maybe made us think that Germany is streaks ahead of us in its energy transition than Spain. But that's not actually what's true. What we now find is that these decisions that we're taking at a European level, unfortunately, are going to lead to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions in the short and the medium term, because replacing Russian gas from gases from other regions and of other characteristics is going to lead to, amongst other things, more pollution. The US is selling us gas which would have never been profitable to extract were it not for the current market conditions. Very bad quality gas from an environmental viewpoint, from the viewpoint of its content. And what's more, we have to import it, we have to transport it to Europe with the gas emissions that provokes. Germany is actually exporting bad quality coal. And in some countries here, for example, the debates are being reopened about whether we should move on to fracking, which is what in the US requires the use of very polluting gas. So in the short term, we've got a serious problem of not being able to combine energy measures with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So in Spain, what we want to do, or at least in the Socialist Party, we want this impact to be as low as possible, because we think that we need to use as a transformation lever the clear evidence of this failure of Europe to going so slowly in its energy transition, excessive dependency on Russian gas and other fossil fuels that come from Russia. So what we believe should be done is we should step on the accelerator. And now we've got a national plan for energy and climate, which has been passed by the Spanish government to meet the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions targets, and also looking towards the 2030 horizon. Currently, Spain has promised by the year 2030 to have reduced its greenhouse gas emissions by 25% since 1990, but as already been explained, Spain is actually going to increase before that level is reached, before benefiting from a public participation tool that we've developed in recent years, which is a citizens' assembly comprising 100 people that have been chosen randomly, but that do have a representative nature. These 100 people have put to the Spanish government almost 200 proposals to improve our climate policy and to raise our ambitions. But this needs to be compatible with realism. And realism and support or solidarity with Europe requires in Spain what's being done in Spain. That is to accept a commitment to reduce our energy consumption and also to reduce the use of our regasification infrastructures, because we have almost 40% of our storage capacity in the whole of Europe. These installations have been underused in recent years, but now these installations are a tool for us, and they're in a way of us participating in the common goal of all Europeans. Spain has a series of factors which justifies this ambitious position, this compatibility between climate emergency and energy emergency. For example, Spain has the best electric grid in Europe, with a huge difference. Our electricity grid is able to manage the fact that renewable energies will never be interrupted more than any other country. Streaks ahead of Germany. Germany for many years has had a deficit in investing in its electricity grid, and that's how it explains how they've got so much solar energy installed, but it's usually for self-consumption, but it's not then uploaded onto the grid because their grid isn't as efficient as ours. So in Spain, we have this advantage. We're becoming, and I've been now for several years, into a country that is a leader in renewable energies. Currently, 47% of our electricity comes from renewable sources, and we are committed by 2050 to getting 100% of energy coming from renewable sources. And what's more, there's the financial support, the incredible financial support, the amount of new resources from Next Generation funds, where, as in the case of Spain, 40% of the 140 billion euros that we'll be getting will be spent on environmental transition projects, and the majority of them are energy transition problems. But please allow me to add that one of the EU's criteria to accept funding from countries from this fund is that all those projects are not just those that are under the banner of economic transition, should respect the principle of no environmental regression. It may be a project to build a port, a road, any kind of infrastructure, but the European Commission means that there should be no environmental regression. And one final issue regarding advantages, our specific relationship with Latin America. In Latin America, ever since 2005, we had a Latin American network of climate change offices, which, despite political changes in all governments, even in our government, has carried on working and is a platform which coordinates and drives forward virtually everything in this region, and is preparing also new initiatives related to the fight against climate change, for example, mitigation, adaptation, and also investments in energies, in transition energies, for example, gas or green hydrogen. Next year, Spain will have the presidency, and during that time there will be a session between Spain and EU, and the government will be able to offer our experience, our Spanish experience in this field, and our connection, the connection with all the countries in Latin America that we've built up over many years. As for tools that we have currently in Spain, from a legislative viewpoint, we've got a Climate Change Act, which is in force. we've got the National Plan for Economy and Climate up to 2030. We've got a roadmap for decarbonization by 2050, following the line set out by the EU. We've got an industrial transition, which is key because, of course, all those changes that we're seeing in energy policy in our countries require a tremendous effort to preserve employment and welfare in those areas that have had as their main activity coal mining or thermal energy plants. There's a fund also that we can also, there's a fund that we can also have from the EU to help create jobs and a differentiated kind of economy in those areas that are specifically vulnerable to energy transition. Spain also has a national plan for adapting to climate change that's been approved, where there are two fields that are specifically sensitive for our country. One is conserving the coast, not just in the Cantabrian area, but more especially in the Mediterranean, is being severely affected by climate change. There's been an increase in the level of the sea, and the whole of the coast is being affected, where there's high population density, and this is one of the challenges that our government is going to try to deal with and preserve the coastal areas, those that are still unbuilt, and seek for alternative for those areas of the coast that are still already been built on. And I haven't forgotten the issue of water. In Spain, we are finalizing the approval of the third cycle of water. And when we talk about climate adaptation, for the first time in the history of water planning, we're looking at a reduction in water used for watering crops. 80% of the fresh water that we have is used for watering plants. This means reducing those areas that are irrigated, and if not, we're going to have to change the kind of crops that we grow, or we're going to have to be efficient in our use of this water. Spain has regulations that meet European Union regulations, that is allowing us to access funds, but that actually requires a paradigm shift, and for this it's vital that the public and public opinion is aware of what's at stake. We need to be aware that our country can't have a production model that doesn't intensively include innovation and technological development. That's why in the National Plan for Recovery, Transition and Resilience, in second place, as far as money goes, our digital agenda. Digital agenda will mean that we can have it throughout the whole of our country, even in the remotest places in Spain, connectivity to encourage job creation, provision of public services, these that needs to be guaranteed both in urban and rural areas. And for this, there's also, of course, European funds available that assist the two other areas that are priority: social and territorial cohesion and gender equality. That is the possibility of providing more jobs for women. As for the evolution in Spain of some indicators, remember that since 1990 until 2005, there was intense continued growth of CO2. In fact, Spain was less developed than other EU countries. This had been taken into account when setting objectives, setting goals at the time. And 2005 was the first year that the amount of greenhouse gases emitted had gone down in comparison to the previous year. Spain joined the market for emissions rights. But remember, since 1984 in Spain, we've had the Institute for Energy Diversification, and this has actually been a transforming lever for our energy provision over the last years. Since in Spain, the wind farms that you saw, both the technology and components came from abroad, and now we've got a situation in which 90% of all the components of wind farms are manufactured locally. In the case of photovoltaic energy, 60% of all components. We've operated a lot until when, in the change of government, there was an end was put to all incentives for renewable energies via a decree which led to a loss of 80,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector, the bankruptcy of many medium, small and large companies, the ruin of many investors, and the return of Spain onto international leadership, which was made worse by the sun tax in 2015, something that never happened in last year. But since 2018, there's been a new impulse to renewable energies in Spain. And as I said earlier before, by 2021, 47% of our electricity had come from renewable sources, with significant increase in photovoltaic energy in recent years, and with a process in this specific case of self-generation, which has in 2 years multiplied, has doubled this kind of system, that is, people that produce their own energy, without Spain even having yet perfectly integrated in its legislation the European directives for self-consumption. Even so, increase in self-consumption has been impressive in recent years, not just from a domestic consumption viewpoint, but something else which is a key, which is in industry, which is now being stepped up, and even more so now because of the price of gas. As for the national plan for recovery and resilience, as I said earlier, 40% is for environmental actions, the majority of which are for climate and energy. And there you'll find projects for energy, the refurbishing of homes and other buildings, an advance in electric mobility, that is the installation of the necessary connections to be able to charge electric vehicles. Of course, investment to encourage storage of renewable energies and compensating with this its development. In recent years, there are now projects for battery manufacturing in Spain, which will not only lead to more job creation, but this possibility of industry being set up related to renewable energies. Of course, green hydrogen projects, not for the day after tomorrow, but that require the commitment of private companies and administrations to locate these projects in several autonomous communities. The most recent one here just around the corner will be in Asturias. And I'm going to close by talking about something which is being voted on in Congress today, which is the Spanish National Plan for Energy Savings, in accordance with the recommendations that are still just recommendations for the moment. Tomorrow, hopefully not, but tomorrow they may well become obligations because we belong to the EU. Spain and Portugal has been allowed to save 7% of their energy consumption, considering a series of factors, but in the 2 first weeks of the application of this national plan, even though it's being convalidated in Congress today, it's already up and running. In Spain, the amount of energy consumption has been reduced by 9.5% in comparison to the previous period. So that means that those measures that some people say are just frivolous, of capping, for example, heating, lighting, air conditioning use, are not just frivolity. They're measures similar to the ones that are being taken by other countries, and now they receive the backing of the majority of parliamentary groups. The Popular Party said that instead of these supposedly frivolous measures, what Spain should do is to prolong the life of nuclear power plants. Just so that you know, nuclear power plants in Spain are still working, and the first that should have been put out of operation is in Almanaz in 2027 and the final one in 2035. So talking today about immediate savings, so saying that the prolongation of the life of nuclear power stations is completely unjustified, with the exception, of course, just concentrating on this energy option. So in general, I think that we are trying to be as collaborative and as supportive as possible in Europe, and I'll end up by saying that everything that we're doing when we talk about a European scale energy and climate policy will only reach more positive results if we do this throughout the Europe, because this has been marginalist, which may have been meaningful a few years ago when the energy sources all had varied and fixed costs that were more or less comparable. Nothing like this market in which there are renewable energies with zero variable costs, because we don't buy the sun, we don't buy the wind, we just need to finance the necessary infrastructures to enjoy that energy. So there are major reasons to change the electricity market. They already exist for many years, but now when we see that the gas price as a whole is affecting all the energies that are part of the energy mix, that's when you see the absurd situation of this kind of market. We need to try to detach the electricity market from the gas price. Spain has done that first with the Iberian exception, but we need to go further than that. And if anybody wants to see the maps that the government publishes every week, just look at the compensation that has to be given to gas companies. We are now very much below the daily price of electricity in France, Germany, and in fact a saving of around 20%. So the next stage will be to analyze with the European Commission the possibilities of deeply changing the electricity market so that people buy the different energy sources at their real price, but not at the price of gas, which is what's being done now. So thanks for giving us this opportunity to debate. Thank you very much, Paco, and thanks to the organizers of this course. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias a las dos Cristinas.
Thank you to both Cristinas. I think you've met our expectations, and the last 25 minutes we haven't been talking about technical, incomprehensible technical things, but policy, pure policy. So congratulations. I think the High Representative would like to say something before handing the floor over to the public. If you want to, please do grab the microphone. This is an extraordinarily important for our course, QUO VADIS Europa. And I'd like to congratulate and thank both our speakers. To the DG for Energy, who in its hands at the moment has the ability to transform the energy mix, and Cristina, who explained quite clearly the situation in Spain. We're talking about geopolitics as well in this event. I'd like to therefore just ask you to consider a couple of ideas. Every time we turn on our gas heater in Spain or burn a molecule of gas that has got to our boiler at 40 kilometers an hour and has probably come from 4,000 kilometers away. Can you imagine how long it took there to get there? To get here? Gas does get here, yes, but it takes a long time. It travels at 40 kilometers an hour, and if it's Russian gas, it's probably come from the gas reserves that are up in the Arctic Circle. If it's come by boat, if it's an American LNG, then before arriving it's had to be cooled to 160 degrees. We've cooled it to 160 degrees, we convert it into gas, we put it into a boat, and it has to be kept cool during the whole of the journey here. And when it reaches here, we heat it up again, so it becomes gas again, and then we put it in a pipeline. I don't know if we're really aware of the extraordinary complexity, technological complexity that's behind the very minor issue of turning the gas heater on. The amount of money and intelligence that's behind this. 5,000 kilometers around from here, somebody made a hole in the ice, they extracted gas, they compressed it, they've put it into a pipeline, they've put it into compression areas that's carried on being pumped. That's the easiest way and the cheapest way. Via pipelines. If it's via boat, then of course it depends on distance. So if you were a gentleman who was going to invest their money in building a gas pipeline, which requires a great deal of money and time, what you would want to achieve would be to be sure that once it's built, you can use it, or use it for at least for sufficient time to get payback. And what that means is you want a safe customer, a guaranteed customer. A customer that's prepared to buy gas for a long, long time. And that's why these investments are only made if there are long-term contracts with a big and safe consumer. And for Russia, that's been us to date. But in the 1960s, we started with that. In 1968, that was when Austria signed the first supply contract with Russia. That's when the Russians started building their gas pipelines. And they've never been constructed had they not had this fixed customer in Europe. Gas is cheap, it's efficient, it can be stored, you can use it little by bit, you can turn on and turn off a gas turbine easily. That's why it's a cutting source energy. You can't do that with a nuclear power plant.
De noche.
And if it's at night and there's no wind, how are you going to cover that energy if there is a high demand? Well, usually there's high demands are not at night, but imagine there is a party and you need gas at that point in time. Or if our neighbor France, his nuclear power plants are corroded, like the problems that they face, or hydraulic plants are not working because there's a drought, and there's no water, like what is happening in Norway, and the main electric exporter is not exporting because they don't have water in Norway. If all of these things happen, then what is the versatile and flexible, instantly mobilized energy? A gas turbine. That's why we are using lots of gas in Spain to supply electric energy to France, so that no connections through the Pyrenees mean problems for France, because France is receiving electricity supplied with gas to complement its nuclear plants, which are at a low point. We are now also, as you know, discussing, because we don't we have the possibility of sending this gas over there. Why don't we just send the gas and then they use it and make use of it? Because there's no pipelines. There's just a couple in the Basque country, but I believe their transport capacity is at 8 billion cubic meters. The billion of cubic meters is the measurement, BCMs. So what is a billion? It's 1,000 million. So that is the measurement unit that we are using. So we can have this BCMs, which is a very small amount. We can also have the MET, and you should talk about this a bit more, to bring gas from Spain to Italy, from Barcelona to Livorno. Now we're bringing gas from Barcelona to Livorno, but we're doing it in a ship. And where does it come from? From Algeria. But there is a pipeline that goes from Algeria to Italy through Sicily, and another one that goes from Almeria in Spain, and another one going through Morocco that Algeria has closed. So that you understand the geopolitics in the Maghreb, the pipeline going through Morocco is shut off by Algeria. Morocco took what it needed, and the rest we got. So Morocco now has to purchase natural gas that gets to Spain, then it's brought, and this pipeline that is closed from Algeria to Spain is open in the other direction, and we're sending it from Spain to Morocco. Does it make sense to have a pipeline through Spain to France and Central Europe? Yes, if we have gas from Algeria. It would only make sense if the Algerian gas exists in a significant amount and a sufficient amount to compensate the investment. The question is, Algeria has production capacity to justify such an investment, and for how long? Because of course we want to not be dependent from Russian gas, but we don't want to be dependent from gas in general terms, because it produces less CO2, but it still produces CO2. The American LNG from the climate change standpoint is not good business, because this LNG has high levels of CO2, so changing Russian gas for American gas is not good for the environment. But the big question is if this pipeline is profitable, unless we use it to transport not oil but hydrogen later on. But could you please explain a bit more what green hydrogen means? Because if there's one that is green, then there's another one that isn't. Therefore, what is the difference between the green and let's say brown? And when we talk about the import of hydrogen from Latin America, what are the figures there? Because the hydrogen coming from Latin America, couldn't that be something we need to produce? What do we need to produce green hydrogen that we have and we don't? Because the transport cost must be really high. So Russia is going to lose its main customer, which is us. Figures say that we've already reduced in half our consumption from them. And now this half is substituted for imports of LNG, and the rhythm that we're changing now, 130 or 140 million will be imported by the end of the year. But the other half, could you please explain those figures? Because the other half, as always, is the most difficult one to reduce. What Qatar tells me is that on the short term it's very difficult for them to increase their production capacity. They have a gas to exploit it, it's difficult. The same thing is said by Algeria. We do have the gas, but it takes time to be able to produce this. Who else is producing it? Well, the US. But also Nigeria. But once again, more ships, the costs, the distances are high. Yes, with the LNG from America substitutes the Russian gas, and it's worse from an environmental standpoint. And Russia gets much more money from oil than gas. Their big source of resources is oil, not gas. And in oil, we will be able to change things, and Russia will be selling their oil in the international markets, and therefore they don't like that Iran is coming back. If the agreement with Iran is closed, they won't be very pleased, because once again, it's someone else that is bringing oil to the market. The good news is that a nuclear agreement is progressing. They've just told me that the U.S. has already answer to the proposal or counter proposal from Iran, and I can say that it's a counter proposal that I also believe is reasonable. In fact, that's why I wanted to say something, because I wanted to give you the information, and I hope there is a journalist here that will tell you about it. So there's a counter proposal to the reasonable counter proposal from Iran, and now the ball is back on Iran's roof. But if there's more oil in the market and we stop purchasing the Russian oil, we will purchase more Iranian oil. But what are the Russians going to do with their oil and gas? Well, they will sell it to India, China, some, and mainly they sell it to India at lower prices than in the international market. They have a discount. And there have been Russian ships loaded with oil that have been some time trying to find a place to bring it, because they were bringing it to Europe, and they've been traveling fully loaded to try and find a place where they could unload it, trying to find a customer. And what is Russia going to do with its gas? Well, China is the answer here. And those that are close to the Arctic polar circle in Finland, to build a pipeline that goes to China. Look at the distance there. Even if it's at 40 kilometers per hour, it's an enormous, gigantic investment, and I don't think it's feasible. But there's also some between Siberia and China, and they're developing this very fast and also building pipelines really fast. When the Chinese decide to do something, they do it quite quickly. And the new sources of Russian gas will get to China. That means that China and Russia will be more united through stronger common interests. But the one that we get now doesn't come from there. It comes from closer areas. And bringing these to China is not possible, I believe. It's not something that will work. So Russia will face a problem on what to do with its gas. And according to the US, Russia is already burning in the atmosphere the gas that they're not sending to us. Because a gas reservoir is not something that you stop and you say you don't want to produce it anymore. It keeps coming out, and if you don't bring it anywhere, then you need to burn it. And now there's gas that is being burned because it goes nowhere. One last consequence that I want you to be aware of: the rise in price of gas doesn't affect us only, but the whole world. And right now there's a competition for gas prices. Every time I go to any international meeting with emerging countries, what they say to us is, you are taking up all of the LNG and the world. You don't want Russian gas, or you don't have Russian gas, and you try and find other gas, and this is produced by Qatar, Nigeria, the US, and I don't know who else right now, Norway. Yes, but Norway, we already have it. But what about new suppliers? Because it's difficult to develop a new gas reservoir. Well, we know how to do it, but it just takes time. But what it means is just rerouting, because the spot market, a ship that was going to one destination, and suddenly there's a buyer that pays a better price, then the ship changes route and goes somewhere else. And there has been the case of ships that have gone through the Panama Channel on 3 occasions with the same load, because they were going in one direction to bring it to one place, and then they said, no, I've been offered a better price somewhere else. Turned around and crossed the Panama Channel again. And once again they said, well, they are paying more money on the other side. This, of course, is just an anecdote. It's not something that always happens, but it is an example of what is the situation in the market and the high tension. And there's a reasonable criticism of third world countries that say, well, you're taking all of our gas, but the gas that we had purchased, because you can pay more than we can. And even more in the financial situation nowadays, the currencies of these countries are devaluating because there is a loss. There is a higher interest in wealthier countries. That means that there's less capital being invested in those countries. And gas is expensive for us, and we pay it in euros. But for a country like Bangladesh that has to pay with their own currency that is depreciated, it's even more expensive. Not only because it has a higher price, but also because their currency is worth less. And in their currency, it becomes even more expensive. If you give me a graph of gas prices, you also need to see the different currencies, and not only see it in euros or dollars. And that way you will be able to see how for someone in a developing country with a weakened currency, gas hasn't multiplied by 10, but much more. And this means that nowadays the gas market is a source of geopolitical conflicts, and that yes, your data was incredible. We've almost doubled or even more the purchase of LNG. But if we hadn't purchased this gas, it would have gone to other places. Not all of it, because there has been an increase in production, but we haven't doubled the production. There has been a lot of rerouting and change in market. And this is something we also need to be aware of. When we say more LNG has been imported, that means it hasn't been imported to other countries. And what do these people do? Well, they use other fuels. And in Africa nowadays, there's a generalized way they're going back to fossil fuels. So they're preaching and how we have to increase our fight against climate change is good, but we have to be aware that in this fight for gas, means that many countries have a more difficult situation to comply with emissions objectives because they have to use other fuels. In fact, Germany is also doing so. If my data is true, there's 13 or 14 coal plants in Germany that have been started to work once again. We don't want to work with nuclear power, but we're working with coal plants. On the short term for climate change, I don't believe it's the best option. But there's always though on a desk, when we say we've increased our LNG imports, that means that someone wasn't able to do so or that had to reduce them. Russia is going to try and find a big alternative customer, and it can only be China nowadays. It is going to be difficult, and they're going to achieve it, and that means that Russia and China will be closer to each other. We now have the famous schisto gas, even though we don't like it, we don't use it in Spain, but we purchase it to the US. In the same way in which we don't like nuclear power, but there's some that don't like it, but they purchase the one produced by their neighbors, which at the end of the day is a nuclear power. And this is something you have to be aware of, because these balances are very difficult at a political level. And it is true that we're achieving what has just been explained, but we have an important problem in our relationship with third world countries that accuse us or tell us or let us know that we are making things even more difficult for them. So even at 90 kilometers per hour in 4,000 kilometers, how can we save gas?
La gran ventaja de no ser economista.
The great advantage of not being an economist is that you may think it's very easy for us. Now the attorney has the floor. No, well, we're all in the same institution, and thank you so much for your comments. I don't have much to add. It is true, and you've said so, Russia has to find a new customer, and with China they're building the Trans-Siberian pipeline that won't be finished till 2028. So maybe that's the reason why Russia hasn't still cut all the gas to the EU, because they need the funds, and also they make more money from oil than from gas, as you explained. It is true that when there is a crisis in the EU, there's a more dramatic element because of the influence of the Ukrainian war. But as you explained, the price of gas and this situation in the global market comes after the recovery of COVID, when China starts to purchase gas in a massive manner, which generates a difficult situation in gas prices. We look at the global price every day. Yesterday we were in 277 euros megawatt hour, and a year ago it was at 50 or 60. So that's the gas price that is used partly to produce electricity, so it makes this more expensive. What third countries say is true. Yes, we're purchasing more gas from the US. It is also true that we're trying to work with the US to reduce methane emissions, but still we haven't reached a full agreement. We have a more ambitious policy. For the first time, the EU has a proposal to reduce methane emissions, and this is being discussed in the European Parliament. And we also want to make it compulsory that those countries that we import to through a certificate system can guarantee that they also reduce methane emissions. We haven't gotten there yet, but we have just started. We don't control the way in which they produce LNG right now, or neither the US nor Nigeria, Norway, nor any other country that is not part of the EU. Regarding High Representative of what you said of the pipeline, or better said, the connection between the Iberian Peninsula and France. It is true that traditionally we worked for many years on a pipeline, the MidCat, that was never developed. It is also true that it doesn't make sense to have a pipeline that is only for gas, because the EU has the commitment that by 2049 it won't be signing any gas contracts. So when Algeria speaks with you, they say, but if in 2049 you're not going to be using it, you're not going to give me a contract. What the companies are saying. So what we're doing now, the new element with hydrogen, is that only the EU could support the building of that interconnection whenever it could be used for green hydrogen or compatible on the short term with green hydrogen. And now let's go on to the colors that you mentioned. Green hydrogen is the hydrogen that is produced through renewable sources. To do that, you need facilities that are called electrolyzers. I'm not an engineer, I have a degree in law, but I know that it works in this manner with electrolyzers. Now in the EU nor in other countries with a potential, we don't have the investment for the infrastructure. The EU is just starting, and we are also starting to work with Latin American countries to see if we have funds to cooperate with them and to be able to invest there to be able to produce green hydrogen. But as you also said, then we have to include the expense in transport, because now we can transport ammonia. And then we have the gray hydrogen coming from gas, and the blue one that can be produced and coming from nuclear energy. And then in the concept of green hydrogen, there's the one manufactured with gas, but guaranteeing that we use coal capturing or collection technologies. In Spain, we haven't developed this because there's a rejection of the public opinion. It's like a nuclear waste, and no one wants us to be under the soil that we live. So that is the problematic of green hydrogen. The main one is that it's very expensive. It's expensive to produce because we don't have the necessary infrastructures to do so. But for it to be expensive and difficult doesn't mean that we don't need to get started. We need to get started and give a first step. And in Spain, fortunately, there are very interesting projects that are going to be funded with the next generation of funds. And it would be a summary of the situation for green hydrogen. Green hydrogen needs electricity for electrolysis and to separate the water. And so you also need water. Can it be water coming from the sea? I really don't know. I don't think so. And why not? Probably a chemical problem. Maybe you can remove the salt from the water first. So water and a source of electricity. But if electricity is renewable, then it's green. So you need wind or sun and water. And we need to go to Latin America to find that. No, we have the commitment of producing before 2030 10 million tons, but also the commitment of importing this 10 million to be able to provide support to those that are developing this technology. It's easier to export it from Morocco than from Argentina or Chile. That it makes sense to bring green hydrogen from Chile? Well, Chile has a program that is potentially highly developed. They have their plan and paper. They are very interested, but they are still estimating if it would make sense. So you need to bring it from where it is, the gas. If it's in Chile, you have to go there, but you manufacture hydrogen. So you can do that here if the ingredients are just water and electricity or renewable electricity. I ask myself, why are we thinking about bringing it from Chile? If you need renewable electricity and water, we can do it here too. Yes, that is in part of the repower plan. There's a double commitment. Internal production, but also working in the Mediterranean basin. I think it makes sense to import it, even though it doesn't make sense to bring it from Chile and Argentina. They've contacted us, but I think it would make more sense to bring it from Morocco. And is Germany going to bring it from Canada? That's what I've heard. Yes, it's like LNG. It's the same business. There's a bigger problem regarding transfer. First of all, LNG exists and it's being transported, and there are plants. So when gas is used, then we have to increase $0.50 to the process. With green hydrogen, as I said before, green hydrogen can be transported, but only the ammonia that is being used for agricultural uses. It's not possible to transport green hydrogen right now. It's not being done, and it's not being produced anywhere. In the EU, only a 2%. Thank you. From the viewpoint of autonomy of the EU, the autonomy of each of our countries, the rejection to fossil fuels is more than justified because of everything we've said. The only fuels, the only energy sources that are present everywhere in the world are sun and wind. In some places, as in Chile, we also have geothermal sources and the tidal energy. But these are somewhere, so we depend on the relationship with that location, and also we have the transport problem. The further it is, more emissions we produce and higher the cost. So anything that is forgetting of having to substitute fossil fuels for renewable sources brings us to a complex path. And I want to add that this is right now one of the challenges, because every euro that we spend to bring more gas from somewhere is not something that we're investing on the storage of renewable energies that is fundamental to guarantee autonomy and sustainability in the future. I'm really sorry, but this gentleman is not using the microphone. Well, we've have time to give the floor. I think there's 4 people that want to say something, so that would be you over there, 1, 2, 3, and I think it's someone at the back of the room. If not, there's 3 questions. Yes, let's get the 3 questions together. Hello, I'm Carolina Aner. I have a PhD on energy, and I would like to ask Director Lobillo what is the situation in the Parliament of the taxonomy of sustainable investments for energy transition, where we would include the nuclear energy and gas on the one hand. On the other hand, I would like to know what's your view from the energy policy in the EU of the role of nuclear energy. Right now it's at 20% in Europe. There's countries where things have gone well with nuclear energy, like for France. It is true that some of the plants are closed, some of them because they're changing fuels, or they are with preventive maintenance, getting ready for the winter. Germany has closed more, and that's why they depend more on Russian gas, and they're using coal, and this has causing difficulties also in transport. They cannot bring that through with ships because of the drought. That's something I read this morning. So we don't have technologies for renewables. Green hydrogen also has its transport and lack of safety problems. So linked to this, it is true that Almaraz till 2027 is going to be open. But if by 2027 we don't have enough storage capacity, we need to foresee this. And if we would have to lengthen the existence of Almaraz, we have to reflect on this a few years previously. Congratulations for your presentations. My name is Jose Luis, and I have a question regarding the rights of emissions, which is another instrument that is being used by the EU to promote the energy transition. And it's also having an influence on the prices in this system that we want to change. There's already been a reform of the regime because there were some problems and gaps regarding the purchase of emissions, and we don't know if it was because of the lobbies that some of these elements were not included and some were not punished. I don't know if I'm wrong regarding this, because they were highly intensive industries in the use of coal. It seems that the 455 package is one of the things that is addressing a change, an amendment of the emissions rights. This means that I believe the European Commission continues to think that this system is valid to reduce emissions and to reach neutrality. There is an adjustment mechanism at the border so that other countries have an analog system. This is a geopolitical weapon for other products to be in our internal market. We demand that they comply, or if not, we make them pay a duty when they come into Europe. I don't know I would like to know what your view on this situation. I have certain doubts, so that's why I wanted to know what your view was.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I got a couple of quick questions. Firstly, the plan for reducing methane that you're working on, what are the measures? Is that by reducing extensive livestock rearing that we've been seeing over the last year, or can it be also used to make energy, or what? And secondly, are there any waste plan for renewable energies, for example, lithium, which I think is very polluting in batteries, and also for solar panels, which is, as far as I know, they are polluting, or the parts of the solar panels are polluting. Are there any plans to try to do something about that? And I'd like to know about green hydrogen uses. Is that to replace gas, or can cars run on green hydrogen? Thank you so much for replying. Thanks. These talks have been very illustrative. What's the behavior of energy companies? Because I would imagine they'd rather profit from their current investment rather than making new one. And what about the behavior of a public energy company? Thank you. As for taxonomy, this is the terminology that's used in the EU, and it's already been adopted. It's been supported by the Parliament, and it's a legislative process in which the Commission puts the legislative act, and that's been voted on by the European Parliament. It's been a controversial legislative act. The press hasn't always presented it correctly. It's a guide, of course, for private investment, where it's not said that gas is never going to be a green energy. It just says that you cannot invest in, you can only invest in gas with under specific conditions. This is important because it's linked to the next question. We have a very clear plan for decarbonizing the economy by 2050, but that requires a process, it requires a transition. Depending upon how our energy matrix will be in 2050, 80% will be electric energy, mainly from renewable sources, while around 12% will be nuclear energy, and then there'll be a small amount in this energy mix of green hydrogen and what we call decarbonized gases. That's the goal that we've set in the EU. However, we're still in 2022. Until we reach this energy mix, we consider gas as a transition energy. We prefer renewable energy, but we can understand that gas is necessary because it's less polluting than oil and coal. That's why that taxonomy is used. It's not that the European Union is saying that gas is green, it's just that it's better to invest in gas than others, providing that you try to make that a green kind of gas. And this investment always needs to be made in the last generation, for example, in the case of nuclear plants. So you've got a Euratom, you remember that contract that was signed when the European construction adventure started, and this is still in force and has been renewed to avoid nuclear waste producing any problems. But I understand that this has been reflected in the press in a different way, and it's always controversial in the press. We in the European Union actually don't have opinions. We only have opinions on renewables. Yes, you have to produce more renewables, we want to fund that. However, there is an article in the treaty, which is Article 194, which says, which is a Bible, those civil servants that work in energy, which says that what's produced is what's important. So if a country wants to produce nuclear energy, the only thing that we say is they should do that according to our treaties, but the Commission never says yes or no. So those are countries that have a nuclear tradition, such as Finland, Slovakia, or France. So they do have in their long-term plans a percentage of nuclear energy. That's about all I can reply. And Cristina, you've got more experience in this than I have. All I can talk about is in this dossier, in regard to this dossier. Remember, in the Paris Accord, there's an obligation to reduce emissions, but each signatory does it in the way that they can. The European Union can do it via the LTS, which is one of its cornerstones, because LTS requires a 43% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and they're referring to heavy industry. When this regulation was put into operation, it's true that they were trying to protect those sectors that would run the risk of offshoring. That is, because they had to pay emission rights, they might move to other countries. That's why, after many years of debate, this CBAN, which is the border adjustment mechanism, which is still being debated, but as it's an EU project, what we're trying to do is avoid people moving away, and those that come to the EU need to respect our regulations. But of course, this is contested by third countries. That doesn't mean that a third country also needs to have an ATS system. It does have to certify that it has at least a similar situation to reduce emissions. It's true that everybody over 194 countries are committed to the Paris Accord, so there's a global commitment, but obviously their economic level isn't the same. That's about all I can say to you. As for methane, two things. One element is the proposal that we've made in the European Commission, which is the first time that we've made a proposal that refers to industry, not agriculture, just industry. And that includes commitments that industry should make There are some that are already established in the UN to reduce methane emissions by 2030 and a certification process when we import energy from third countries. And secondly, last year in the COMP, which is where the implementation of the Paris Accord is debated, an international agreement was signed to reduce methane. I think it's 102 countries that have decided to reduce by 30% methane emissions by 2030. But it's a political declaration. It doesn't have any. It's a declaration of principles which we want to contribute to, but still isn't developed at a legislative level. And then waste. You spoke about waste. In the EU, what we've regulated so far, we've regulated many aspects because that's what we're interested in renewable energies. And we're not just talking about wind farms, biomass, sun, photovoltaic. In the European Commission, there is a center called the Joint Research Center, which is where impact studies are carried out. And these elements about how to eliminate this waste in the future is currently being studied so that it can be included in legislation in the future, but it's still incipient. You also asked me about hydrogen. Hydrogen, or green hydrogen, or blue, or whatever, but especially green, cannot completely replace gas. Green hydrogen can be used for maritime transport in those transports that are difficult to reduce to zero, but also in industry. But they can't replace. It'll be reduced by renewable energies. That's what the. And then some questions about companies. I think that companies, even those companies that traditionally have produced gas, are very, very interested in rerouting plans and change radically what they produce, because in a few years from now, nobody's going to buy gas. People will buy energy from renewable sources, so both Spanish, Austrian, French companies are completely changing their economic way. It's true. There are some people that produce gas, but I want to be a little optimistic here, because the majority are changing their design for the next years to follow the European plans for decarbonizing the economy. In the plan for closing nuclear power plants, there's a roadmap for the gradual replacement, for replacing the electricity that's generated by each of these plants. And currently, we are actually moving more swiftly for replacing this that was originally forecast in this original plan. So nuclear power plants won't be closed until they've been covered by the production of energy via renewable sources. But for that to happen, it's actually important to invest in renewable energy storage, so that that they're always available. They don't need systematically some basic energy. But we have a roadmap, and that closes in 2035. But I think we're not going to replace fossil fuels only with renewable sources. We're going to have to do it with an increase, a very notable increase in energy reduction. That is consuming less energy in developed countries, which is not necessary to guarantee welfare or prosperity. We need to reduce our energy consumption so that the future is without fossil fuels, because energy from renewable sources creates also waste. So we're not going to be able to maintain the standard of energy consumption of the wealthiest countries that we have now. We need to offer more restraint. We need to be more frugal and it's possible to do that without reducing our welfare or prosperity. But this is something which we're seeing now. To what extent this may be controversial. Are we happier with 29 degrees or 28 degrees? And the amount of health problems we're going to do. I've got more questions out there that a couple more have been asked. Paula and the gentleman at the back. But all week we've been told off that we should be finishing at 5, so please be as quick as possible. Paula, the floor is yours. Germany has announced today some energy measures to contain energy use similar to the Spanish one, so I would imagine the majority of the destructive criticism of these measures will disappear. As for other issues, is there any project for biomass to be used to produce electricity? That's all I wanted to ask. Paula at the back. Please be as quick as the last person. I'm from Huelva, by the way. Huelva has been chosen to build this green hydrogen plant. It's great to be here listening. 2 questions, one for each of you. Cristina, Lobillo, can you tell us a little bit more about renewable energies in the long term, whether it's going to be wind, solar, or others? And Cristina, Narbona, I liked it when you spoke about the projects of climate change, and I wanted to ask you, how is it possible that in the Spanish citizenship it's more important to have 28 or 27 degrees? I mean, is the Spanish society reluctant to change? You asked to take the floor. Yes. And then the final question at the back. Good afternoon. My name's Blanca from Santander. When we talk about gas, for once we're in a lucky situation because we've got 6 gas pipelines. I'm hoping that we make use of them. As for hydrogen, of course, hydrogen can be made using renewable energies. The problem is transporting it, because Cristina is going to have to say to me that it has, I think it has to be transported at 300 degrees below zero, and I doubt very much that there are boats prepared to do so as things stand at the moment. And finally, I wanted to ask a question. Does the European Union have some plan to buy energy in common, for a common purchase of energy? The final question, please. Thank you. My name is Tomás Reyes, and I've been on this course on many occasions. One first question about the Commission's ability to react, or the European Union institutions' ability to react to these kind of crises. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea illegally. The east of Ukraine was destabilized. Russia started behaving as an aggressor. We saw that in its participation in Brexit and its involvement in electoral campaigns. Why is it that we've had to wait until a war in Ukraine to start to reduce our energy dependence on Russia? What went wrong for this narrative? And maybe this is an internal joke after yesterday's sessions. How come the narrative around the world hasn't had an impact on the Commission's policies until recently? Second question about, and I know that the word nuclear is a adjective that people shiver at, and it's controversial, but the Commission forms part of an international project which is seeking a way out via nuclear fission. Nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion, which is not being spoken about nowadays. It's been left outside public discourse. It's something that, at a given moment in time, had a great deal of repercussion, participation. The Commission is still participating in this project. And I'd like to know whether CETA, which is what the project's called, has any possibility of following the path that it was originally designed for. And I'd also just like to say thank you to everybody who's given us the possibility for spending this time in Santander to debate the future of Europe. Thank you so much.
No, a lo que han preguntado. Por desgracia, lo de las críticas contra el decreto que se está debatiendo.
Unfortunately, the criticisms of the decree that's being debated today has gone from, oh, this is just frivolities. Maybe if there'd been more negotiation, it would have been voted upon. But there have been meetings and contacts between the Vice President and autonomous regions, city councils and companies from the energy sector who have made it obvious that there has been dialogue. It may well be that there's more or less good faith when interpreting this. What about biomass? This is also being convalidated. A specific decree to prevent forest fires, which, as I said before, this year have been devastating because of some of the transformations that we're seeing in the atmosphere and in soils. The government has made it obligatory for all autonomous communities to have prevention plans for forest fires that need to be enforced throughout the whole of the year. The majority of autonomous regions have some prevention programs, but within these prevention programs, quite clearly there's a measure that you mentioned, that is the collection and transformation of residual forest biomass into a fuel to generate electricity or heat. And this is something that's within the agreement that's been made with all autonomous communities. There will be agreements to create regional centers where residual forest biomass can be used, and I think this will be fairly important. And our friend from Huelva said, why don't people appreciate the measures that the government does? Of course, we can probably communicate that better, and we're trying to do so. It's also true that if you see how the media, even public media, get across to the public the situation that we're living through, you'd probably think, you'd be very disheartened, because it's really difficult to see a news program in which 90% of what you see, it just complaints and upset and problems, which I'm sure exist, but where in each of the fields of this, with these problems, where there are many good examples which are not being mentioned. There's a continuous problem of communication, but also there's a problem of disenchantment with the public towards politicians. We need to be aware of that. Firstly, the pandemic, then the crisis, now inflation. And what's this creating is this feeling amongst the public that those who govern are not able to avoid certain problems. And this is just like when you talk about why do you get anti-democratic populist movements, the thing is that you can only cure this with more democracy, more determination, more measures to help people that need this policy. That's the only kind of measurement. We need to be more active so that people think about their salary, their health, and regasifiers and gas. Spain has had and still does have a surplus for gas production because of the surplus of combined cycle and regasifying plants. And isn't that interesting now, especially in regasifying plants? It's very, very convenient. But in this time, as there was a construction bubble, there was also a gas bubble. We've got a surplus here. We don't need to worry too much about the reduction of nuclear energy because we've got abundant combined cycles, and we're going to see that. As for fusion nuclear energy, this is an important project. And depending on who manages it, will probably not have results, even in the best scenario, until 20 years hence. By then, either we've been able to reverse climate change, or not even with fusion will we be able to save ourselves from the worst consequences. That's why we talk about climate emergency, because we're in a decisive decade to change the evolution of the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Cristina, you've got 90 seconds to take the floor, because I know you've got a meeting. You asked... We have got a basically religious principle, which is technological neutrality. Member states can use whichever renewable energy they want, because everybody has different climate conditions and every country is different. So that's regarding your question. Transport, we've already spoken about. The problem of alternative energy sources, not only just the production of this energy source, but also its transport, that costs more. So it's also true that there's no perfect situation. That's why we need to say that the final option needs to be as profitable as possible. And that's something that we do in the European Commission, and is always at the corner of any legislative proposals that we make. And then, Thomas, thank you so much. It's great to see you. And thank you for your questions. Here I would like to add something. We haven't started to diversify gas that we import now, nor did we do it in 2014. It was done before that. We started back in 2011, 2012. In 2014, the Commission made this proposal in which it said that each country needs to have at least 3 gas sources. One needs to be LNG. Maybe that hasn't been, as Cristina said, communicated in the correct way. That's a bit of self-criticism, and I think this is something that we in the Commission do, as do member states. But as we said earlier, the problem is now that the water's up to... Our balls are on the chopping block, as we would say vulgarly.
De todo el mundo, voy a dar por terminada esta sesión.
I'm going to close this session because there's only 2 minutes till 5:30, and I think we've covered quite broadly the whole of these subjects. And so all I can say is thanks to both of the Cristinas for having been so illustrative, for the High Representative for having given us the geostrategic side of the information, all of you for your patience, your loyalty, and for the very pertinent questions. Tomorrow, closing session, which we've kept the best till last. So see you back here at 10 o'clock tomorrow.